Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV. As you all know by now, I'm also the founder and CEO at SFO Continuity, a private membership organization, and Family Office Masterclass. This is what I believe to be my final live and interview of 2023. And we have a special guest on who I haven't interviewed in many a year, back in my old podcasting format, probably back around 2018, maybe 2019 was the last time. The subject, Silicon Valley Chief People Officer shares insights into becoming a top tier family office. It features Lyn Christensen. I would like to give you all a little bit of context because Lyn has a pretty incredible background. I know it's normally not something I do often, but I think this helps to give context to today's discussion. Lyn is unique in her operational behavior and people operations professional who has helped grow and develop top technology companies and family offices. Her focus has been on high growth startups and has been a trusted advisor to CEOs and executive teams that lead talent acquisition, coaching, training, mergers and integrations, cultural building, strategy, and change management. Lyn's career took off early thanks to her ability to gain trust among entrepreneurs and executive teams. She met someone you might have heard, Elon Musk, shortly after he was raising funding for his first startup, which was Zip2, and that led through a successful acquisition by Compaq. Elon then asked her to join his next venture, X.com, which later merged with PayPal and led to an IPO and acquisition by eBay. Most recently, Lyn has been an entrepreneur as well as an advisor on two top family offices. She is currently the co-founder and CFO, COO at Reimagine Wellness. Lyn, it's been too long. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And everyone, pardon me, that probably wasn't my best read of all time. I haven't done as much of these in the last month as I've been, as many of you know, traveling to Europe. A lot of that content will be released in first and second week of January. And my room is a little darker than it normally is. It actually looks cooler, I think, on video, but not as good for my eyes in terms of reading.
Well, I think you're best when you're just speaking from the heart anyway. So reading is hard for anybody.
Exactly. Well, let's get started. People are not necessarily the most important asset. The right people are, courtesy, of course, to Jim Collins of Good to Great and Built to Last. The best and worst part, I would say, of any family office, depending on what you make of it, is going to be your people. So I'd like to talk a little bit foundationally about the importance of my big three in order are people definitively number one in today's world, followed by technology two, and systems, and then probably ideas. The only catch is systems and ideas are basically a people created. It's a byproduct of people. So this really all comes down to the people in your family office are going to be the biggest determinant to its success. Am I right? Or where am I wrong?
Well, I mean, I think that's true with almost any company. It's to a greater degree in a service organization or a highly skilled organization where people and their decision making have such a huge impact. And I think the smaller the organization, the more critical the people are, because every single person has a huge disproportionate impact. So most family offices are on the smaller side relative to a public company or something. So it's even more important. But what I find is they want to shortcut the hiring process. For whatever reason, it's just something that isn't a priority. And I feel that they have to, I've seen a lot of people learn through mishires or the wrong hires.
Oh, that never happens in a family office. And it's just shocking in that they usually sold a business or were a major equity holder
Right.
in a company, a tech startup, or maybe a GP in a fund or venture capital, whatever it may be. Today's world is certainly different. And now their business effectively is their legacy, their wealth, their resources whatever, hundreds of millions to often billions or decabillions, and it doesn't quite get that level of attention that perhaps their initiation into their entrepreneurial endeavor did. It drives me crazy, but it appears to be, unfortunately, a common trait among many.
Yeah. And if I could say, I just thought of something else that differentiates is family offices tend to keep employees much longer. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but for example, in the tech world, everything is bottom line driven. And so you'll see a lot of reorgs. When things aren't exactly working, they reorg, they shift people. And I see family offices are quite reluctant to do that. And I think sometimes that is to their detriment, that they keep people on who've outgrown the organization or the needs of the family. I've seen a lot of times they will move someone into another role to retain them, and it's not ideal. So each situation is unique, but I've seen that run into some challenges also.
100%. I'm going to mention another company that Elon did not start, but he's definitely the driving force and the figurehead and how it relates to employees and hiring, and that would be Tesla. Candidates, and I'm reading a little bit, that thought they were generally aligned with Tesla's mission. So now this is going to go to how we're going to kind of correlate Tesla's mission and the family office mission. And you would know better than me. They often had MBAs applying for entry-level positions, not for the salary or the greatness of the job, but to kind of get their foot in the door. And in reading and learning a little bit about the history and culture of Tesla, which I think would relate a little bit back to Elon, there was a 1-year minimum in the job before promotions of internally at Tesla. And I think the general consensus early on, by hiring those people in arguably they were overqualified for, they were generally unhappy weeks into the job. So they stopped hiring from that perspective. How that could correlate to a family office is, how do you weed out, not hire competent people, but they're not a good fit?
Yeah, it's a complex answer. I usually try to find out people's motivations, dig deeper, not just your standard questions like why do they want to be in a family office. I have some I have some stories, but I really go to, I don't think anyone, and Google's done a lot of studies on this, you can't really gauge very well in an interview. So I think you have to use multiple points of validation. You need to check references. You need to talk to people that have worked with them. You need to look, if you can get a referral from a trusted person, that's your highest probability of success. If there's someone in your organization who's succeeding and understands the culture and they refer a candidate, the chances of that person succeeding go way up. So I think it's not your traditional look at a resume, go through interviews, hire someone, because it's very niche-y, family office, and it doesn't fit everyone. So I think you have to have a higher bar, not a bar, but your screening has to be extremely vigilant. Background checks too, very vigilant background checks.
We're going to catch up on some of that a little bit later. I have some perhaps unique thoughts on that. Staying a little bit in flow, a expert in recruiting mentioned to me, in kind of preparing more from the employee perspective or prospective employee, it probably is good, maybe in traditional tech companies, to talk about their past achievements, or even better, obstacles they've overcome. Some people say using the so-called STAR method: situation, task, action, result. Switching the role a little bit to now advising a qualified potential employee, how would you help them or recommend that they stand out among a sea of many qualified candidates?
Yeah, that's interesting. Someone just asked me this who was applying for a family office role, and he was on the more junior side. And so my advice to him was to talk about the breadth of experience, different experiences he'd had, which showed his flexibility and his ability to adapt. Because I do think that's a big need in family office, to wear a bunch of different hats and really be a problem solver. It's not one job that prepares you for that. So I think I said, look, talk. He goes, well, I don't have that much experience. I said, well, talk about all the different summer jobs you had when you worked for your uncle on the vineyard, every different thing you've done and how that shaped you. And I think personalizing, I think people got away from personalizing for a while. I actually think people need to bring that back in. Like, what does make you unique? Like, talk honestly about that. It's not just your GPA and where you went to school. What is special about you? And that's usually what I try to tell people. And it's what I notice with candidates. When I see a really plain vanilla resume, even if it's well written, it's sort of like, it's not, it doesn't get me excited. When I see someone that puts something a little different, there's like a little spark in their resume, it gets my attention.
That's great advice, actually. So very helpful, I'm sure, to our audience.
Good.
It may be a little off track for a family office because it's different. Technically, per legal structuring, it might be theoretically a for-profit entity for tax benefits in the family office. Not to get too deep into lender versus the IRS. We covered that actually several times in December. But the best candidates often thrive in mission-oriented meritocracy, where performance maybe isn't left to chance by the family or the leaders in the family office. And really, the best idea, in theory, should win. But that's often not the case.
Right.
In many family offices that tend to be more top down, tend to be a little bit more outdated, a hierarchy in a certain kind of way. And I know we're jumping from hiring an employee to now they're here, and how are they going to make an impact, and how are they going to make a difference?
Yeah, I think it's related. It was an adjustment for me. I'll speak from my own, from coming from tech where everything was the best idea wins, to personal preference in a family office. And I had to adjust to that ultimately there might be something that the family values that isn't the most practical or logical or whatever adjective you want to use, but it's what they prefer. And so ultimately, you have to understand what their priorities and values are and adjust to that. And that's why I talked about the flexible person, because if you come in thinking you know best, it'll be tough. And I'm not saying there isn't room for expertise, but there's also a different ethos in a family office where ultimately it's at the family's discretion. So that is a more service-oriented mindset than a profit-driven or product-driven orientation.
Oh, an internal HR person for one of the most successful hedge fund managers ever here closer to my backyard also worked on multiple times building out the family office for the principal, and did mention there's a learning process in terms of kind of what you just said now and what you said before, and that it's not always the most qualified person or the best on their competency that's going to be the best fit. Emphasis on the word the best fit in a single family office that is unique, that is generally small, commonly under 10 employees. Like you said, one person does make an impact. Do they add to the culture? Are they buying into the concept of what the goals are within the family? Or are they really, really, really smart, very competent, but difficult? And therefore, they're making it difficult for the others in a small office that can't hide from them. How do you weed out, for lack of a better word, someone who, wow, look at this resume. They're actually really competent, but I'm interviewing them and I'm just not feeling it as a good fit for this office.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it kind of goes back to what I said, which is you got to look more broadly than just the interview. Like who have they worked with that you can talk to? What were they like? Try to get a broader sense of who they are, because I think team player is probably the most important thing in a family office. It's one of the top, requirements, because you're right. Someone who's really competent, but likes to be an individual contributor and not collaborate, that's tough. So you've got to figure out, I think a lot of the other thing, family offices don't always define their culture or their values. And I think that should be a starting point. If you can define your values, you can look for that in candidates. If you're not exactly sure what they are, it's harder to identify.
100%. And again, I always talk about the buck stops effectively with the family. Well, my family office, it's not really that good. Well, I don't know. You've been created it. It's been running it for 4 years. Of course, you could blame the leadership and the people inside it, but how about you? Like,
Right.
are you holding it to a certain standard? What are the expectations? Are the goals clearly identified? And what's the tracking mechanism in terms of accomplishing what you want to accomplish with being hands-on in the family office? The majority of family offices, things we'll get into a little bit later, are really not that great relative to a benchmark, which is very hard to do in a family office. And unfortunately, the majority don't really last past the wealth creator and commonly don't even last 10 or 15 years. Let's dive a little bit, and this all ties in into whether you're creating from scratch or perhaps even more complicated, onboarding into an existing family office. So you have a candidate that you believe is competent, is going to be a good fit, is not just going to meld into the culture, but hopefully be additive and be a value to it as well. So they're competent, they're well compensated. So in theory, they're motivated, but none of that, even if they're actually a good fit with the others, none of that is any sort of guarantee that if they're not onboarded properly, that they're going to be successful. And I know a family office is different than a tech company, a hedge fund, etc. But there are rigorous institutional principles that do, no matter what family offices tell us, that do cross over. They need, in my opinion, they need a 30-day, a 90-day, a 6-month, and a 1-year plan. Do you believe that? And how do you help to create and monitor that?
Yeah, it's really about who manages them. I mean, one thing I see in family office is not clear, like maybe let's just say I know one small family office, it's about 10 people, like you were mentioning. There's a COO, and that's the only manager. Everyone else is doing the job they were hired for, not a management role. That's a very big job to manage 9 people. And she doesn't have a lot of time, and it doesn't work that well as far as having, goals and having time. I shouldn't say it doesn't work well. She's doing a phenomenal job, but I just see the strain on the system. And I think sometimes they look at that as overhead, but I think you've really got to have the bandwidth to have a good handbook, have good documentation. This goes to your systems, have some systems that work for people. A lot of times, these are people that aren't sitting at a desk. They're not doing a desk job. And so having resources they can get to after hours, have a portal, have things where they can check on whatever they need that doesn't require a human necessarily. There's a lot of ways to help facilitate, the goals, the expectations. But it does take time up front. And that's the piece I see people not invest in, is that like laying the groundwork. And that's important. And I think the onboarding is even more important than in a big company, because there aren't always people to learn from. Sometimes you're in a new role. It's a small organization. There's no one to mentor you necessarily. Sometimes there is, which that's ideal. But if there isn't, it's sort of trial by fire.
And related to that, in my opinion, and I'll use the example of the under 10-person family office. You said there's one person, more of a COO, but kind of probably alongside the family, the most senior person in the family office. And I'm going to make the assumption that they're competent and they fit in good. So
Yeah.
and they're well compensated. I'm making those assumptions, but what leads the principal to feel that that person is a good leader, that person develops culture, that person knows when someone needs a kick in the butt, when someone needs a pat in the back, and effectively is deeper than just their core competency. They're displaying the skills to be in management and executive. Not everyone who's good in finance, legal, and accounting and cyber is going to be good coaching, mentoring, and working with people under them.
In fact, a small percentage will actually do both.
Even worse than I thought.
Across the board. I don't know what the percentage is, but I'd say it's less than 50%. Like, just because
Sure.
you're good at something doesn't mean you'll be a good manager. There's training for that, though. I mean, people can improve. I think some principals don't get that involved. And I think that it's really hard to assess what your leadership team is doing day to day. I think 360s are a good way for the family to check in on how a manager's doing. Then they can give feedback, and then the team gives feedback. And if everyone participates in a 360, you get a nice, you get a 360 view of how it's going. But not everyone's motivated to do something about it. And that's one of the hurdles I have found, is that it's good enough, and they don't want to spend the time. But there are tools out there. And I mean, I think there's an intuitive level to how things are going. And then there's a deeper level if you really want metrics, if you want to use systems and different tools for that kind of thing. It really depends on the appetite, I think.
Yes, I mean, I'm kind of a believer. I know it adds a little bit to the family office and cost, but some would define it as effectively a chief of staff. I
Mhm.
think it's important to have a level of mentors. You could argue it may be the family, it may be boards and committees that are working with or helping assist the family office. And relative back to the onboarding, and I'm a huge believer of having, again, 30, 60, 90, 6 month and 1 year plans, but you also brought up something that's really important as well. Besides mentoring and some level of training, how about an employee manual? How about the expectations are clear? And if you're the person who's supervising the person coming on, how are you going to do that unless you know the progress that they're making on goals? And I'm sorry, it needs to be a little bit more structured than how most family offices doing it now. Why aren't they not only having the employee manual and clear expectations that I noted that you could comment on, but why aren't they using often project management software?
I'm not sure. I think, look, in my personal experience, we tried it at one family office. And for example, the housekeepers found it very difficult. I'm just using an example because their jobs are very repetitive. They found it very hard to set new goals. They weren't very technologically oriented. So they found it a burden. But across the board, I think it's still a good practice. I think, I remember other positions had similar complaints like, well, we don't, we're just executing on the maintenance, or their nannies, or they're the chefs, or what, but I still feel like having everything roll up. In a perfect world, you get a high level set of goals from the principals, the family members, and then that goes down the organization throughout and trickles down to individual and departmental goals. That would be a best practice. I rarely see that happen.
I agree, probably 5 or 10% of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not as much in the household staff that you're noting. From my perspective, having worked in corporate America, also having been in dozens of significant, some decabillion family offices around the world, one of the reasons for my trip to Europe, uh, like, there's ways to do it more rigorous and institutional. And I know you're going to deem that to be more of a burden, more work. Oh, not everyone's going to be on board. I mean, to me, if you're not looking for greatness in the family office, I don't get it. But that's just me. There are some people that say, listen, I want the privacy, I want the control. It may not be great. It's good enough for me. I'm like, okay, like who am I to tell them otherwise? A little bit of my principles, also having respected many people from Silicon Valley, and I'm a huge fan of Andy Grove and people like that. And we're going to get to objective and key results in a second. But I am a believer, and I mean, maybe I'm too hands on, that especially for someone you're onboarding, but even someone who's existing, I think you should be doing meetings with them. And we're going to get to face versus remote and virtual in a second. But even remote and virtual is better than not at all. How do I know the progress they're making, other than I think they should be using project management, if we're not doing group meetings, setting big goals, checking progress, and then one-on-one, even if it's 20 minutes once a week? Am I outdated in today's world? But I think that's what you have to do.
Yeah. I mean, unless it's so small that you can really tell just by looking around because it's such a small team. I think a lot of investment groups do a good job of measuring and tracking. I think, some of the accounting teams. I think when it gets into some of the other departments is where I see it drop off. But no, it's very hard to tell what people are doing. You get a little snippet here and there, and the bigger it gets, the harder it is to have a handle on that. And um, there are tools out there. I like the project management tools. It keeps
Mhm.
everybody rowing together, and knowing what their deliverables are.
In my opinion, again, you need to be hands-on. You can't settle for average, and I wouldn't even settle for good. I could argue good's the enemy of great. And I know it's hard to benchmark. Family offices are unique and different. We'll get to a little bit of that shortly. And I know the industry and especially the executives get mad at me when I talk like this. I don't mean to be over the top. I actually want you to be excellent. And I actually think you could be. Things we're going to get to in a second. Here's one where I've gone a little back and forth on, and coming back from Europe, literally, with no exaggeration, meeting 5 families that go back between 500 and over 1,000 years. I might have learned a thing or two about governance on this trip, and I thought I was pretty fluid in it already. But I've gone back and forth. The greatest threat to the family is the family. Henceforth, why do most family offices not have at least one person or a focus on the family? They should be, in my opinion, potentially active in governance in helping the family through retreats and structures and governance and professionals. But there is an other train of thought that people say, Angelo, just have them stick to their competency in whatever, finance, legal, accounting, cyber, household management, and let the family worry about their governance, teaching the rising generation. I could make a point for either or, but I don't know. Again, maybe I'm a really hands-on kind of person. I do think the family office in most circumstances should maybe have a chief learning officer, should be more hands-on with the family, helping to assure their family continuity.
I see that as a personal preference. I tend to prefer what you're saying, unless a family is really engaged. What I see happen sometimes is they want to be engaged, but they don't do it to the level that's needed, and so therefore it gets harder. But I have seen families do it well, especially next gen stuff. Some of them are really engaged with that. And if they are, then they can fulfill some of those roles. But if they don't have that inside the family, they should look to make sure they have all those things covered. Even if it's one person who has as part of their job, maybe it's not a dedicated position, but maybe it's someone who can add that into their, like the governance and the next gen and the whatever the other needs they have. And you can also use outside resources. You can have the hybrid where you've got dedicated, you don't need them to be full-time, but you have a dedicated external resource who has an expertise in one of these areas. That's another, I've seen that work really well if you can find the right person. And I will say, if they advise multiple family offices, you actually get the benefit of someone who sees what other family offices are doing, kind of like I see, and you start to be able to compare and contrast the best practices. So in a way, if you could go to an expert in whatever X and they advise, say, 5 to 10 family offices, then you're getting this wealth of experience with that one person.
And I did mention the great Andy Grove before. Obviously, as you know, he's a Silicon Valley legend. To me, one of the greatest executives ever.
Yes.
His principles, I think to this day, decades later, still carry on. You could argue, of course, we all need to adapt. And I know I'm a dinosaur and a little bit of a hands-on, a principle of how things used to be, which I miss and I think we're better. But Andy Grove popularized what I would define as OKRs, objectives and key results, talking about a commitment to priorities, connection to teamwork, tracking for accountability, and probably the important one, stretching for amazing performance. And again, we kind of hinted at it. Most SFOs are not stretching for amazing performance. And I'm not even talking about investing, just broadly in general. Wouldn't they benefit from principles that Grove and others have done highly successfully, that basically that's what made Google, are the things that I'm talking about now? They're actually not that hard. You just have to commit to them.
You
Why
have to
is this
prioritize
horrible
it.
for a family office?
Yeah. When I was in my early 20s, I had a roommate who was I was pretty focused actually. She was unbelievably focused and she documented all of her goals. She was and when she said to me one time, you get what you measure.
Yes.
And it was just hit me like I realized watching her, it was absolutely true. Her output exceeded anything I'd ever seen because she tracked it all. It's why they want you to write when you're on a diet, why you have to track everything you've eaten, because
Macro and micro, for sure.
otherwise you actually don't know what you're getting. And so you can take that to any level you want, but the more you track something, the more you will get that result that you're aiming for. The thing you're tracking, you're going to become more accountable to it. So there's really no arguing that. I guess it's just a question of how much do you want that thing and how valuable is it? And how much can you set that as a cultural norm?
Good luck. By the way, because you got me intrigued, this woman sounds amazing. Did she ever end up creating her own wealth to create her own family office?
I didn't stay in contact with her. She was actually one of those people. She was a lot to take. I mean, in our early 20s, someone that focused and intense. So I did not stay in contact. Not that I wasn't fond of her. We didn't stay in contact. So I don't know what happened to her, but she was accomplished concert pianist. She was a very good student. She was just someone had taught that to her. They had said, if you measure everything you do and write your goals down and follow up, you're going to, it will lead you down to a result. And
even pre-Andy Grove, that goes somewhat back to Peter Drucker and the great work that he did. You need to be able to measure in terms of to understand it's okay to measure and admit that maybe what you're doing isn't that great. That makes you know that so you can improve that.
Right.
Like we're just so sensitive to uncovering our blind spots and our faults and our ego gets in the way. If she didn't create her own wealth to create a family office, there's some family office principal out there. I don't know how you're going to do it. You track down this woman, you pay her whatever she wants because she's going to be worth it.
It's true. I'm sure that is true. And you're right, because I do think there is an ego element for all of us that it is uncomfortable to uncover that something you're bought into is not working.
We're going to get into why family offices fail, which is going to talk a little bit about that. Staying on Andy Grove a little bit and how John Doerr also incorporated these principles in his advice to Google. And again, I think it was great for them to get leaps in productivity on innovation, Doerr said, following Google's gospel of 10x. Now, again, I know people are going to put too much of an investment theme into that. It's not impossible, but I get it. It's different. But how do you measure? You did hint at it earlier that it's harder. How do you measure things that aren't investing centric to understand what maybe needs to be improved on? And why don't you aim big? Why are you trying to get incrementally 10% better when you should be looking to get 10x better?
Yeah. I think sometimes families don't know what they want. That maybe is a controversial statement. I think if they were really clear, this might be easier. But sometimes I think it's actually a little nebulous for them. And therefore, it's hard to get it out in the organization. But look, the more clear they can be on what really matters to them, if a family could paint a picture of this is what we are hoping to achieve, that could be translated into goals across the organization. Just let me use a housekeeping example, even though that is redundant. If the family said, hey, we'd like all the heavy lifting, all the big projects to be done while we're away. We want the fewest number of disruptions to our life. We want the fewest number of people in the house when we're around. We don't care if you bring in an army while we're away. Whatever it is, if they could say this is what we consider the gold standard, then that can be executed to. But I think what happens is it's not completely clear. And so then that goes down, the organization, it gets less and less clear and people don't know. And I had a complaint come back up about a housekeeper who was just kind of hanging around, and it made the family feel awkward. And it wasn't she was hanging around, she was waiting for instructions of what to do, but they considered it like awkward, personal space. She had no idea, and that's a really simple example, but I just think that look, I do it myself. I have a hard time giving feedback about my personal preferences in my home. If I have someone come clean the house, I don't like to say, oh, you did that wrong. I like it like this. Unless it's a really big deal, I just don't say anything. And I think that happens a lot in family office on the softer areas of the family office that are more personal. It's different when you're talking about financial objectives and philanthropy objectives. But even that, it just requires clarity. The more clear that they can, that is what I end up advising on, is the more clear you can get about what your objectives are, the easier the organization will have in operating towards that.
100%. And that relates a lot to communication that's honest and fair and not being critical, but understanding blind spots and ego, things that we discussed before, to simply make you better. Like if I'm the principal, I want to pay you the maximum amount of money to make you a top level executive or employee compared to your peers. I only ask for greatness. And I think the principles of how to become great, okay, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I did mention before that benchmarking in a family office is ever so hard. Other industries you could compare competitors to, and you could understand kind of where you rank. So benchmarking in a family office is incredibly hard. I actually give a sports analogy for benchmarking because a sport like basketball is played by millions and millions of people. We quantify you being great because you're drafted or accepted into the NBA, the highest standard. Therefore, the competition is wickedly fierce. It's very statistically driven, so it's very quantifiable. And, the example I give, you could be the last person on the bench. You're never going to be Curry, LeBron James, or Michael Jordan. It's too competitive. That die's already been cast at the age you are now. You could maybe get a little better and be a good part of the team, and that's great. The good news for a family office is it's not that level of competition. There's not that many to quote unquote benchmark against. It's not as quantifiable where you need to be also born with certain physical gifts. I actually think you could go from mediocrity, how I would define that, to actually excellence in the family office by, I think, instituting some of the things we spoke about today. But I don't know, after a certain age, is that age 35 or 40? And I think Ray Dalio has spoken somewhat about this. Are we kind of set in our ways with our blind spots, our ego, the fact that we're competent enough? Stop putting the spotlight on me. I'm good enough. I'm getting paid. I'm happy. I don't want to be great. I don't want to be held to that standard. I've been accused of being very negative on the family office executive culture. I don't mean to be that way. I really want them to make a truckload of money. I just want them to be great and stop accepting mediocrity. Am I that wrong?
Well, it's how you define it. Like I said, I think it really comes down to their preference. And look, I think it's all about motivation. At any age, if someone's motivated, they can adapt, they can change, they can look inward. It's not as common as we get older. I see it myself, like I kind of, oh, this is how I've always done it. And I have to remind myself, okay, things change, and you got to adapt. But it comes down to what the priorities are. And I think sometimes the priority is low turnover and the priority is continuity. And if that's the priority, then greatness is probably not the objective. And so in that regard, you're not wrong, but they have a different goal for what they want at their family office.
I mean, as I travel the world and I'm more active as a consultant now in the community, you're correct. There are times when I find like, listen, I'm hearing what you want and you're in charge. I'm probably not a great fit. I'm a little bit type A. I do like to drive to greatness. And like you just said, that's probably not what you want to accomplish with your family office or your rising generations at this time. I'm for a very limited subgroup of people that really do want to have greatness in their family office. And I know I throw that word out there as if it's so easy. Going from good to great, like Colin spoke about, that's a big, big jump. It may only be a 10% improvement, but that 10% improvement, once you're already damn good, it's very hard to do. One executive told me something that I never forgot. He believed in journaling, and he believed in his executives to journal in the morning and at the end of the day, and then do maybe a weekly recap. And that allowed them to identify the behaviors and actions they took that led to more positive outcomes. So arguably that could be repeated more often. What's wrong with that?
I like it. And it's not intimidating.
Correct. That's probably a little softer than some of the other things that we spoke about with the intense weekly meetings or daily morning check-in.
It was a little more introspective. That could be a really nice lead-in.
And I think we kind of hinted at it throughout our discussion so far, but I will go to why family offices fail. Often simply it's the principal, a little bit older. They want to have privacy control and customization. They create an SFO. It's very driven top down from them. They now get older. They lose some level of interest. They get perhaps disabled, or no one lives forever. And the rising generation doesn't feel engaged, doesn't feel the family office is listening to them actively, and maybe has more diversity in terms of the age ranges in their family office. And it just kind of fizzles out. That may be 7 years, it may be 10 years, it may be 15 years, but that is common. Now, I could go deeper into a lack of expectations, a lack of goals, some of the issues we spoke about in terms of a lack of greatness and excellence, compensation issues, blind spots, ego. Why, in your opinion, do most family offices, how I define it, which may be a little conservative, kind of inevitably fail?
I actually haven't seen a lot fail, but I've also been on the early end of most of the tech family offices. But I have seen some what you're describing, and what I've seen is the patriarch or the initial wealth creator sets it up, hires their people, and that their people go through life with that principal, and then the next gen is not connected to those people. They're peers of the principal. The next gen is much younger. They're like, those are my dad's people, they don't get me. And that creates a chasm of some kind. And then the younger gen wants some kind of change, and so they either, it's all different kinds of changes, but they want to be seen for who they are. And so maybe it doesn't derail the family office, but there's some major change that happens where they want to bring in people that they feel are listening to them.
A little bit back into the hiring situation. And again, I may be thinking more classically in big tech and hedge funds and all that, but to me, this still applies in the family office. Successful people are often self-motivated. They make it their business to be competent, to be great, and know their jobs and then some inside and out. How do you screen for that when you're potentially looking to build or restructure a family office? Or is that kind of not that important to often most principals? They just want, again, here's the task at hand, just do it and we're good.
It just varies so much. It's hard to give one answer to that. I think it matters to some people, and if it matters, they need to be more vigilant. And if it's more of a task driven, then maybe I think a lot of people that are just task driven, they could outsource this stuff. If you don't need a trusted inside person, go get the best tested, resource that's a contract basis. It's probably safer. You can make changes more easily. But if you're really looking for a trusted, competent inside person, I think you've got to put the effort into really vetting that.
There's another quote that I take from kind of a little bit of the history of Tesla, that certain senior managers didn't even necessarily have an advanced degree. They were inherently curious, and they had, the words they use, a savage work ethic. Whereas they had others that were up the wazoo with masters and PhDs, but they just didn't work as effectively, as efficiently, or rather, let's be blunt, as hard. How do you identify, this goes back to the resume, how do you identify someone who's going to, I don't know if I'd say the word go the extra mile, but why don't we go with that?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I remember back in the day, Elon wouldn't even interview anyone that put letters after their name. He's like, right there, that just shows that they're not workers. They're people that are impressed by the letters after their names. He wouldn't. He just like, they're out. So like, it's just funny because I kind of have that bias from Silicon Valley that anyone who puts Esquire or CPA or whatever is not a startup person. You know, to me, it just screams like I'm very big company, check the box kind of person. So
I want to be called doctor as a PhD.
yeah, exactly.
No offense, PhDs.
Well, it's kind of a West Coast versus East Coast thing too, but I'm just using that as an example. So it doesn't surprise me that he would hire people that didn't have any degree because he didn't really care. It's really about their, their work ethic. So I think that comes out in interviews if you were asked the right questions. Again, I always try to find someone that they've worked with to talk to and find out what they're really like. Some people interview really well. I try to find out what they're really about. There was one candidate for a family office that I argued vehemently against hiring. They hired him. And I raised the reasons. And it turns out my concerns were all validated after the person started. And he just wanted to join for like status reasons and had no interest in working. And I had these concerns, but he was so charming and he interviewed so well that everyone really liked him. So I tend to be a little more skeptical on like really just falling for someone in an interview.
I have no chance, Lyn. I'm a charming guy. That's all I have. I'm not that competent. Speaking of that,
Funny
psychology test. So of course there's Myers-Briggs, there's others. I'm assuming it's to weed out to some degree, let's be blunt, people with psychopathic tendencies or narcissists. Now, no offense, certain psychopaths and narcissists, there are certain positions and probably evolutionary biology, I would say certain military positions that may be an advantage. And rather bluntly, in sales, probably having a little bit of narcissism, depending on which variation and type, a great belief in yourself, that's probably not quite as warranted. It's not necessarily a negative per se, but in a small family office, a small cultural environment, I think both of those could be very, very bad.
Mm-hmm. I don't know that those tests can really show those things, but it kind of it can show extremes. And when Compaq acquired that first company that I worked with Elon, I had to go through a big test and it was an all day thing, maybe 10 hours. It was a lot. And they put every vice president through it. And I remember the results, they wrote a whole report and it was super interesting because they would say something like, this individual will do best with a nurturing manager, for example. And this individual will do best with a really straightforward, goal-oriented manager. They had different things that would come out as recommendations for the workplace. I found that very interesting. I actually haven't gone back and used it since. It was a very big company, but I found the practical advice that came out of their testing really helpful. So I do think there's something to it. If you're not skilled in using or interpreting it, I think you can get yourself into trouble. Like if you just give someone a Myers-Briggs and you decide to interpret it, I think you're kind of stepping into some unknown territory.
And let's talk a little bit about HR. So I will start, Lyn, by asking, did you ever watch or were a fan of the very well-known TV show, The Office?
I did not watch it. Everyone loves it though. And I even have the little, I have one of the little characters somebody gave me as a little desk thing.
Well, my audience has had me bring up before. There's an HR person.
Yes.
His name is Toby in the show, and he's probably a nice guy, but he's kind of a little bit of incompetent.
Yeah, we get maligned a lot. I know.
I mean, he's a little overly PC, a little bit of the office, a little bit of keeping an eye on things that annoys people. And I do
Mhm.
think there's a grain of truth to that, that unfortunately, maybe more so and less so in Silicon Valley and smaller organizations, but in large Fortune 500 companies, it's gotten, I want to be careful with my verbiage. Why don't I just go with the word again, a little PC? Uh, I like the word that I used in our title, Chief People Officer. Don't I want someone who's obsessed with people that are obsessed to be great? And I know I keep on going back to that. In a world of the family office, that doesn't seem to respect or understand that too much. But what is, and maybe it's just semantics, but the nuance of insourced or outsourced HR for a family office, and maybe I'm just using a play of words on a chief people officer. But I think I've heard Alex and Layla Hermosi talk about that and others. Cody Sanchez, people that I respect. I kind of like that word chief people officer better.
Yeah, no, it was a big shift from HR. It really connotated, something bigger. Like you said, the emphasis around people, not being a resource, but people driving the organization, driving the business. And so I thought it was very progressive when there was a shift towards, CPOs. And I found that the best companies were the ones adopting that first, moving away. It used to be personnel, then it was HR, and now, then it went to people, people team, people officer, that kind of thing. So, and it really was about what you started with, which people are the number one asset.
Yes, therefore, uh, in my opinion, in a family office, I can make the argument in a larger institutional level family office. I'm not so sure that a chief people officer who's really good and obsessed with obsession and greatness in the family office may not be the most important person. I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian, perhaps controversial in today's world point of view. Of course, COVID changed things. Technology got pushed to the forefront, which in many ways was good. The opportunity to be remote. We're doing StreamYard now. Others love Zoom and Google and all these wonderful technology and platforms. Maybe again, I'm going back to my 70s and 80s roots of being a little bit old fashioned. I think there's certain times when the remote and virtual can have elements of being good. I think if you're building a family, especially if you're building a family office and it's new, or you're looking to onboard new employees, especially if they're younger, how could you do that remotely? You need people in the office.
Yeah. It's very hard to start something remotely. I think once it's up and running, it's a little easier. I actually see the trend going more towards coming back to the office, and maybe not full time, but it's coming back, at least part time. And I honestly do feel that people who start have a very tough time onboarding into the culture. It takes far, far longer. If you've been with a company for a long time, it's easier, but you lose something without having that contact. And especially when things are difficult, when things are going well, it's easier, but then you don't have those credits in the bank, like I've spent time hanging out with you. And so therefore, when we have a difficult conversation, we're already in a better place to have that conversation. It's really tough when it's all remote and you have to pick up the phone or schedule a meeting online. There's a barrier there.
100%. I have maybe two or three more, what I would say family office centric questions, but my audience will kill me. They're already mad at me for not doing it earlier, but I had to have somewhat of a hook. We mentioned it once or twice, and I mentioned it in the bio. You have the incredible experience of working early on when Elon was relatively a young entrepreneur, and you had a rather senior position talking about kind of the chief people officer of the importance of people onboarding into his company. We don't need to know secrets. And you hinted at one. He doesn't like letters at the end of their name in a resume. What principles or lessons that you might have learned from Elon, even as a younger entrepreneur, but as you watched him from afar now, creating multiple multi-billion-dollar companies, truly amazing, that what a family office could learn from either entrepreneurial spirit or maybe more importantly, employees and hiring, besides what you said about being a little careful on the letters at the end of a name and a resume?
And I don't know if that's still true, but back in the day, that was one of his things. It's funny. I still work with a colleague that we worked with Elon back in the day, and Elon actually asked me to join Tesla as well, and I turned that one down. But
The stock options, Lyn.
I know. It's okay. But I knew he was exceptional. I mean, I met him when he was in his maybe early 20s, and I'm a few years older than he is, but we were peers, and I knew he was exceptional, but I just didn't know he would accomplish everything that he said he was going to. He even back in his 20s, he was talking about dying on Mars. And so all this stuff that's come out, it's no surprise to me. He said all of this. This is not new. And so anyway, I was talking to this other friend who was the CFO back in the day with us. And I was saying, isn't it wild to see all the stuff Elon's done? And I said, his ability to pivot. Well, first of all, his belief in himself, and I don't mean that in a strictly egotistical way. He just didn't look at obstacles the way most humans do. He was so laser focused without questioning his objectives, which most people have more doubt, and he just didn't. He always doubled down. He always believed in himself. He never thought someone else was going to do it better. And again, not in this huge ego way. It's hard to explain. He just had this way of thinking. And anyway, his ability to pivot, he would just try things. And if it didn't work, he constantly pivoted. And I hear so many people, they're like, oh, I'm a startup person. I like small companies. I think that's the exception. I rarely find people that are actually as flexible as they say they are, or willing to roll up their sleeves. And Elon could just sense that in people, and he would just gravitate to greatness. I mean, he could just see it, and it was just so interesting to watch how quickly he picked up on things and adjusted. And I just think most people don't. They set a course and they're bought in and they stay on that course. And there were so many times that we could have gone under, things could have gone sideways, and he would never give up the ship. He would just flip it in a way that would then turn into something else. It was incredible.
I mean, it's probably a rumor because it does sound great, but I think he netted probably around 100 million from PayPal. Yeah. And I believe the story is 7 years later. So in theory, he had the 100 million that he probably also.
I think it was 200 and something million because
then the story is even more amazing because the story basically is, and you don't have to comment, is even 7 years later, he actually was relatively in some financial struggles.
Oh, he went to almost zero in 2008. Yeah. I'm still in very close contact with him then, and he was about to go to zero, and he was still doubling down because he was doing SpaceX and Tesla was in such a dark period, and he was putting so much money into SpaceX before they were funded, and he was down to fumes, but he would always put his own money in, raise his own money. He never doubted that was going to come through. And most people can't do that. They just don't have what it takes to take those risks.
I want the audience to think about this for a second. Possibly, depending on the level of leverage and debt, he might have even had a negative net worth, meaning he's walking down the street and there's a homeless person who has no negative net worth. In theory, Elon's in a worse financial situation than that person. It's just crazy. The amount of people that have become incredibly successful entrepreneurs, billionaires, decabillionaires, hundreds of billions in Elon's case, it's amazing how calm, if that's the right word, they are under tremendous pressure and how they could sleep at night knowing they may be a massive amount of money in debt, yet they have the confidence, the competence to be able to know they're going to get out of it. I'm sure some don't and it fails, so those don't make great stories. I get it. But that's an amazing story about Elon.
Right. No, that's the trait that you can't really, I think you're born with that or you're not. I don't know that you can develop that, but that was the unique aspect of him.
A superpower.
For sure. It was for sure. And he in his 20s, definitely other people that age did not get him. He was very different in that way because he was so, he wasn't about like having fun and kicking back. He was very focused.
I think that's kind of a requirement to being
Right,
incredibly
right,
successful.
right.
I would think so. There is something I talk about, and part of this may relate a little bit to Elon in part of it. And I wouldn't say it's woo-woo, but it's a little out there for the family office world. And pardon me, I know I'm on conservative Greenwich, Connecticut, East Coast, a little bit of Wyoming, but I have a little bit of West Coast kind of in me somewhere. I always talk about, are you a historian or are you a revolutionary? And I actually think that both are positive. You have a direction, you have a culture, and being a historian means that you're probably intellectual, you understand the past, you know that it won't necessarily repeat, but it might rhyme. So having the opportunity of respecting what came before you, and I mentioned people like Andy Grove, I mentioned John Doerr, I could go back to the 1800s with the legendary military and governmental and entrepreneurial figures and scientists. I respect being a historian. But if you're only a historian, if you only look at the past for answers moving forward, sadly, there's a role for you. But I think it may be a little bit more limiting. I think you probably need to be partially a historian, but partially a revolutionary. And I know that sounds crazy for the family office world. So maybe we'll put it 90% historian, 10% revolutionary.
Mhm.
But I think you need to be able to somewhat see around corners for threats and for opportunities. And again, I may be getting a little out there, but how do you marry looking at what's important to the family, then looking at building or restructuring their family office? And maybe if everyone is too much of a historian, in my weird example, or too much of a revolutionary, both of those extremes might be really bad. How do you kind of have someone who's more balanced?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. It's like, maybe it's a 50-50, I don't know, but you need to see around the corner. You need to anticipate and read the tea leaves, but you also need to have a stability and a practicality. So I think it's got to be that combination of a really just a steady player. I mean, that is very important in family office, but not so steady that they just do things rote. There needs to be some creativity and some good problem solving skills.
I would say great. Well, certain companies could be destroyed by crisis. Good companies survive them, but great companies are improved by them.
Right.
Maybe not in the short term. Maybe there's even a hit to a family's financial, quote unquote, resources, but they're now more anti-fragile. How do family offices incorporate some of those principles to be more, let's go with the word, anti-fragile?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to address that. You're gonna stump me on the last
I
question.
mean, I think it also simply comes down to the people.
Yeah.
If you have great people that are incentivized, that are the right people for your family office, and you know that if they're down 1% on the investment portfolio, when the markets are down 500 basis points, they're not going to get crushed by the
I
principal.
mean, it really is true. The good people will rally through a crisis, whereas if it's already a fragile system, the crisis will crush them. So I do think it's related to how strong the entity is going into a crisis.
Speaking of your old backyard of Silicon Valley, I'm also a big fan of Paul Graham, and he wrote a very famous piece called Makers and Managers. And it's brilliant. Some people are more creative and they work better at different times of the day. But I'm going to make a statement that is going to make me sound now like the old stogie from greater East Coast. My experience is that, and again, most family offices are not hyper creative anyway. My experience is that, and I know Elon's different than this, most successful people, in my experience, including my interviews with billionaires, most successful people are at their best in the morning, and they're usually early risers before 6 o'clock. That's something that I've noticed. I know everyone's different. I know it goes against the great Paul Graham at Makers and Managers. We all may work better at different times of the day. But what has been your experience being a people person and in what you do? Are there certain people that work better at varying times of the day, and are most successful people that lean to be more analytical tend to be better as morning people?
Yeah, I think I like to get up early and I'm better in the morning, but tech people engineers in particular are rarely that way. And even my brother had a very successful career at Microsoft. I mean, no, and he was there early on. Nobody really showed up early on the engineering team. They tend to stay late, work late. And it was definitely the case at the tech startups I did. So there's probably a lot of psychological analysis behind this, but Silicon Valley is not an early culture in general. And I think it's because of the orientation to the tech world. Whereas the finance world is the opposite. People get up at the crack of dawn.
That is true. That's a little bit of a cultural thing. I think you hinted at it earlier. Pretty straightforward advice to a family office is identify what's most important to you as a family. And if it's really important and you want to also keep it more private and have it customized, that's what you focus on in your family office. And then maybe slowly you build your family office, if applicable, beyond that. But why aren't you better off outsourcing what you don't need to be excellent in internally? That either you can't recruit the type of talent or you're not paying them. Well, I want to build a great investment team of direct investors. Well, now you're competing with VCs, with private equity, with real estate firms where top people are making millions and millions of dollars a year.
Right. Yeah, no, that's it. I think you got to figure out what's most important. Start with that. Try to have a vision of, and then hire to that and really have some sort of plan. Versus, and you want to start with hiring the more senior people because they'll help you decide how to build out the organization and make recommendations on some of this stuff. Like, hey, we don't need internal security, for example, or maybe we don't need, IT could be outsourced or whatever. They could help decide on those next level down positions. But what do you want at the top level? Is it a CEO, a COO, a CIO? What is it? And what does it look like? Like I would actually draw out an org chart. If I were advising a family, I would make them sit down and say, like, let's draw this out.
Excellent idea. And what do you think about the impact of AI on a chief people officer? Not as much being replaced yet, but as an augmented tool to perhaps make better decisions or have the family office be more effective?
Yeah. I haven't seen it come into family office too much yet, but I know that it will. It'll be interesting. There's just so much capability there. And, a lot of the lower level functions could end up being done by robots. So I think a lot of like numbers related things and tracking and maybe compliance. Like, I don't know. I haven't seen it happen yet, but I mean, we're around the corner from it.
Of course. And I believe my last question, you obviously have been incredible with understanding the value of people, the work in your experience, also having created and restructured family offices. Maybe what insight could you give my audience in the last year or two, perhaps working with Silicon Valley tech-centric families that are creating an SFO? What trends are you seeing? What are they doing differently? Let's make it a little broader. What obstacles are they having that you're helping them to overcome?
I would say the growth, people outgrowing jobs is one of the pain points. As the family grows and changes, a lot of these people created their wealth very young. They didn't have families, and now that's shifting. And how does the family office shift to address the needs of the broader family now? And I think they're using technology to solve more of their problems, or maybe achieve what they want. I shouldn't say problems, but to achieve. They have more automation. I think I've told you one of them has built their own portal where they can, get approvals and have expenses, and everything's integrated into one family office portal. The family can also has access to it. They can, so like, any 24/7 people can access that. I think that I guess my biggest piece of advice I always say is like, don't shortcut the hiring process. That's where I see mishires happen. Even if you have one dream candidate, go lay out a process and follow your process and stick to it. See a few comparison candidates, check references, do the background check. Don't shortcut it. Don't hire a friend. I'm sure there's an exception, but that's a general rule. Don't hire a friend. And just try to be really thoughtful about your people, because it'll be your greatest asset and your greatest pain point if it is the wrong hire.
I could guarantee that. And Lyn, for those that would like to learn more about what you're doing, how could they both learn a little bit more and reach out to you?
I'm Lyn Christensen at gmail.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, Lyn Christensen. And if someone wants to reach out to me, I can provide additional contact.
Of course. And anyone could also reach out to me. I'm happy to make an intro, whatever happens to work. In my close, it was fantastic to interview Lyn. I've known Lyn for multiple years. She's been a wonderful resource, and I've learned so much about people, tech family offices, and so much more, as hopefully some of you and I've learned. I'm just curious in this kind of discussion that we had today. Again, many of you know me for many a year, being the founder and longtime CEO at Family Office Association. I sold my interest earlier this year, but you may be hearing this after the first. So technically that would be in early 2023. And I'm really excited in terms of what I'm doing now, putting my decades of experience together, not just my more media enterprise and Family Office TV, but the more intimate and intricate work that I do with families in my SFO continuity, which is both a membership organization and my consultancy arm, and the work that I do in education in the family office world, where we spend a lot of time on the importance of people, on onboarding, and the value in creating and restructuring into a top level. And you all know, if you didn't by now, after hearing this interview, striving for greatness in the family office. So I'm proud of what I've accomplished, thanks to the help of many amazing people, but I'm more excited about moving forward in a more intimate way, working with a more intimate group of people. Many of you know I came back from Europe. I'll be doing a lot of work in Europe, and then transitioning a little bit into perhaps parts of the Middle East and Asia, and really kind of bringing the family office intellectual community of best practices together and sharing. And that really is my love and what I love to do. And as we talked about today, I think it's undeniable until AI is at a very different level, which I hope is many decades away, but maybe sooner than I think. People are the most important asset by far and determinant of success within a family office. You have to do it right. If you're concerned about missing out on results, on access, then yes, becoming part of what I'm doing and reaching out, I think is an important part towards that. And wonderful people in what I call kind of my dream team and people that I know, including like Lyn, and I highly encourage you to reach out. I'm also happy to make an intro. On that note, I hope you all have a great end of the year if you are watching this right prior to the end of the year. And if not, and either or, a great 2024 as well. I'm primarily available at angelorobles.com. I'm active on all social media platforms, more and more active really than ever before, and have a chance to reach out. I'm happy to connect. On that note, Lyn, thank you for being on. Great guest. Have a wonderful end of the year and a happy new year. And I look forward to seeing many of you soon, and have a great 2024, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.